Hi everyone. This lecture is focusing on learning and memory. And just a little bit about the distinction between learning and memory. We usually think about learning as involving acquisition of knowledge, and memory as more like retaining that knowledge over time or being able to recall it at a later time. Um, Obviously, there's a whole lot more involved with learning and memory. There's different kinds of conditioning, classical, operant, observational learning, and different types of memory, which we'll review a little bit, but we're not going to spend too much detail or too much time on that, rather, because these are things that you should have already learned in intro psych at least. So I do encourage you to look back over your notes from intro psych at the different kinds of learning and the different kinds of memory. We will do just a little bit of review of the different types of memory to refresh your memory. But again, for more detail, I do encourage you to look back at your notes from your introduction to psychology course or general psychology, whatever it's called here. But yeah, so anyway, we do have different types of memory, different divisions of memory. We have the sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. Long-term memory further divides into declarative memory and procedural memory. Declarative memory further divides into episodic memory and semantic memory. So let's actually do an example of sensory memory. So sensory memory is very, very short, right? Only lasts a few seconds depending on which sensory system we're talking about, whether it's the visual system or auditory system, what we see, what we hear. But yeah, kind of in general, we think of sensory memory as lasting between 1 and 4 seconds, although again, it does depend on which sensory system we're talking about. Short-term memory is also very short, slightly longer than sensory memory, but short-term memory is more like 15 to 30 seconds, so still very short. Long-term memory is the more kind of permanent, long-term, supposedly you can remember everything from long-term, except that's not true. We'll talk about some factors involved with that. But yeah, so sensory memory, we're gonna try an example of change blindness. So let's look at the following image. Let's look at this picture for a little while. And then let's look at the next image, which is very, very, very similar. There is one very subtle difference. Let's see if we can find it. And we can actually go back to the first image. Let's go back to this one and look at that and try to see what's the difference. It's a very, very subtle difference. Here's the first image. Here's the second image. And the pictures are almost exactly identical, but yeah, there's a very small, very subtle difference. So let's look at it one more time, the first image. And the second image, and actually here I've circled what the difference is, that this little leaf in this position is not in the first image. If we look back at the first image, it's not there, and in the second image, it's there. So again, this is really, really hard to see, to notice this difference. And so if you didn't notice it, almost everybody doesn't notice it. Because again, there's a lot of these little kinds of blossoms or leaves or whatever all over the place. There's a lot of these similar kinds of features and little detail. And of course, we're all looking at the rabbit because it's so cute. But yeah, so this is an example of change blindness, that when there is a very subtle difference, a lot of times we don't pick up on it. And again, thinking about our sensory memory, our visual memory does not last long at all. And so we're trying to look at the picture. Odds are we kind of just get the gist, right? We think about, okay, there's some leaves and blossoms and some dried grass and a rabbit. We're not looking at every single little thing. I mean, if we do, that's interesting. But yeah, as far as we're not encoding, we're not taking the little detailed information in, and so then we're blind to a change. This shows that some different examples, and there's been a lot of like prank shows on TV or just pranks to do, where you know, like they'll have people trying to see if there's a difference. So like there's a common one is that like you have a customer service representative interacting with somebody. And then like they go behind the desk and that, or they go to a different room, and then a different customer service representative comes out and then looks to see if the customer notices, or maybe it could be the same person, but now they have on like a fake mustache or something, and they look to see if the person notices the difference. And so this is a similar, there's a lot of examples in this where especially one guy is asking people on the street for directions and holding up a map and trying to see, you know, where is this place. And so the people are giving the directions, and then they get separated. Like, so there are some people that are like walking through with a large painting or something, and so then behind the painting, the original person asking for directions switches with another person, and then the second person continues to ask for directions, and then they look to see if the helper, the person that's helping give directions, actually notices the switch, which in most cases they don't notice, and then in some cases they're like, wait, what, you know, and things like that. So it's a funny it's funny things to it's funny. But yeah, so again, that if we're not noticing all the detail, if we're not encoding the information about, you know, like how a person looks, or even we can think about the text on the screen or things that we see outside or whatever, if we're not really encoding that information, we lose it. That sensory memory, things that are held in our sensory memory are not held for very long at all. So steps in the memory pathway, I've been talking about encoding. Encoding is the first step, that when you're taking in, excuse me. Sorry about that. Remember, I have allergies, seasonal allergies. I love the spring weather. Oh, it's so nice, but allergies. Anyway, encoding is that first step in taking in the information. So you need to take in the information. You know, you're exposed to the information, you see a person, but if you're not really paying attention to the features of the person, of their face or hair or whatever, and then especially if they exchange with another person, like you won't necessarily be able to tell. Or even when we're looking, oh, we can think like when you're looking in the mirror at yourself, you're doing your hair or whatever, and then, or you're maybe just checking your hair and checking to see, oh, do you look okay? And then you turn away from the mirror and you go on your way and you're like, wait a minute, do I really look okay? How's my hair? And so, yeah, like if you didn't encode that information, if you looked at yourself in the mirror but didn't encode it, didn't take in that information, then you're not going to remember to be like, oh yeah, I look fine. Or, oh, this is a different person. So encoding is the first step. You have to bring the information in, not just be exposed to the information or stimulus, but start to take that information in. And then storage or consolidation is, storing is, you know, storage over time, holding on to that information over time. Consolidation can involve kind of strengthening the memory and possibly transferring it to long-term memory. And then retrieval is when you want to retrieve, when you want to recall that information. So like on an exam, that you're trying to retrieve what you have learned, what's in your memory as far as memory, or what different structures of the brain are responsible for. Retrieval is that process of being able to retrieve, being able to remember what's in your memory. Okay, so we can actually think about these steps of memory as the analogy of the computer, where first you're encoding, you're typing things in on the keyboard, you're entering information onto your hard drive. Your storage is like your hard drive, your internal hard drive, where you're storing that information over time. And then retrieval is like the monitor, like your computer screen, that when you're trying to retrieve that information to use it for something, that you're able to present that information on the screen, present it, you know, on your mind to answer an exam question or something like that. With the types of memory, so again, first we start with some stimulus. First, it goes into our sensory memory, which again can last between 1 to 4 seconds, depending on which sensory system we're talking about. If we're not really paying attention to the information, if we're not encoding that information, we can just lose that information. Otherwise, if we are kind of thinking about it and encoding it, it can go, excuse me, into our short-term memory. Our short-term memory, again, is still very short. It's longer than sensory memory, but still relatively short. And it's more like 15 to 30 seconds. Things are in your short-term memory, unless you're using some memory strategy. If you're trying to remember, you know, a phone number or something, you might be repeating the number. That's rehearsal. That you might be repeating it several times. You might come up with some strategy to see like a pattern of how the numbers are related together. They're all even numbers. They're ascending order, you know, whatever, or like what the first 3 digits add up to be this number, you know, whatever, coming up with some strategy to remember the number, or if you're remembering some words or things like that. If we are doing some rehearsal or some memory strategy, we can transfer that information to our long-term memory. If not, we can lose that information. And so then if information gets transferred to the long-term memory, then, oops, sorry, we can, that is the relatively permanent, supposedly unlimited capacity. In theory, we should be able to remember everything from long-term memory. Once it gets in there, we should be able to bring it back to our short-term memory or working memory. We'll come back to that working memory to use it, but that's not always the case. One thing we know is that there are a lot of factors that can influence consolidation, the strengthening of memories, can also influence encoding, that bringing in that information, that first taking in that information. There are different factors that can help with encoding. There are some that can interfere with encoding. So one factor is with time, that we can think about even for encoding and then also for consolidation, that some people need more time to, you know, like maybe like reading your textbook. Some people need more time to read it and reread it and reread it to then take in that information, to encode the information or consolidate to make those memories stronger over time. We can also think, very much related to time, is emotion, and especially like interest. That if you are reading something that interests you, that might take less time. Or you're hearing something, your romantic partner is saying some exciting things to you, that might take less time to remember. That could be, so emotion in terms of different kinds of emotions, which anxiety is a different emotion that can have usually not helpful effects on our memory. But emotional significance, so things that are more significant to us, more meaningful, like what our romantic partner is saying, compared to reading a textbook, which may or may not interest you, may or may not have emotional significance to you. So then if it's less interesting, you might need more time to read it and to encode the information and strengthen that information over time. Compared to if it's something really you perceive as exciting, which could be in a positive way or a negative way. We can think about if there's a poisonous snake that's, you know, on the loose in your home, that's exciting, but in a bad way, right? Like that's, you know, a fearful kind of thing. You're like, ah, get it, ah, you know, and so that's something that will take less time to encode that information, to consolidate that information, because it has that emotional significance. With the emotional significance, and especially, you know, thinking about a poisonous snake or something like that, that the secretion of epinephrine and cortisol can play a role in this too. So we see that small to moderate amounts of cortisol can activate the amygdala and the hippocampus, as well as the cerebral cortex. And so small to moderate amounts of cortisol can help with encoding, with consolidation, because it's activating some of these structures that are involved with memory. But when we have higher amounts of cortisol, so especially thinking about anxiety when we're stressed out, that tends to interfere with encoding and consolidation. And of course, we can even think about how we're doing during the pandemic situation. And I know a lot of us are experiencing a lot of anxiety. And maybe you guys have already noticed that how it might be affecting your memory. And if you haven't noticed, I mean, obviously we have so many things on our mind right now, but think about that, yeah, is it a little bit harder to concentrate or to remember things or things like that? We do see that the higher amounts of cortisol, you know, like more prolonged stress, prolonged anxiety tends to interfere with memory. Okay, working memory we talked a little bit more about, or a bit about before. So working memory is very short-term, very temporary storage. It's not the same thing as short-term memory. It actually involves this actively attending to or manipulating information. We can think about it like as problem solving. When you're asked a question, you're trying to come up with the answer or you're trying to solve a problem. Like the question about, you know, let's go back to this slide. How might higher amounts of cortisol affect memory? If we were thinking about that and trying to answer that question, that information would be in our working memory. Our working memory is active as we're trying to figure out and answer this question. Or like when you're taking the exam, when you're trying to think of the answer to the question, your working memory was active. You were trying to remember, you know, like what does the hippocampus do? And which may not have been on the last exam, but it'll probably be on the next exam. But yeah, so trying to think about that, trying to remember, trying to solve some problem, even just listening or focusing attention. Like right now, hopefully, working memory, the topic of working memory is in your working memory, because as you're reading this, as you're listening to what we're talking about, so that's that actively manipulating information. We know that the prefrontal cortex is especially involved with working memory. We see that if the prefrontal cortex is damaged, that tends to impair working memory performance. We've talked a little bit before about aging adults and some changes in the brain, especially in the prefrontal cortex. And remember that aging adults don't necessarily all experience the same brain changes. Some people experience decreased activity in the prefrontal cortex. Others experience increased activity in the prefrontal cortex. And we can see some differences between their working memory, their processing speed too. That in general, aging adults who have kind of slower, kind of declining activity in the prefrontal cortex also tend to have kind of declining memory, processing speed. If you're having a conversation or they're trying to answer a problem, it might take them a little bit longer. Compared to some older individuals actually have increased activity in the prefrontal cortex, and they don't show those impairments with working memory. And we actually see that some aging adults with increased activity in the prefrontal cortex, it's actually more activity, it's a higher amount of activity than even a younger adult. And so it's kind of thought that maybe it's that increased activity in the prefrontal cortex is compensating if there's any impairments or declines in other areas of the brain. When we had talked before about brain development, we mentioned about the hippocampus, that there can be some shrinking in healthy aging adults. There's a lot more shrinking in dementia, Alzheimer's, things like that. But even in healthy aging adults, there can be some shrinking of the hippocampus, which of course is very much related to memory. But some people do have that increased activity in the prefrontal cortex, which to kind of compensate, and prefrontal cortex is involved with memory too. And so some interesting things, and again, just keep in mind, there are different possible changes that older adults can experience. There has been some research on monkeys, looking at aging monkeys, and some research suggests that having stimulant drugs can enhance the activity in the prefrontal cortex. So for maybe some of those that naturally have decreased activity, the stimulant drugs can enhance that activity and improve memory. So that's something some research, not all research, has been finding that it's maybe a potential treatment, thinking about for humans with impaired memory. But again, this is not, you know, conclusive yet. It's just some preliminary research. Okay, let's shift gears and talk a little bit about amnesia. So in general, amnesia relates to memory loss. There are different kinds of amnesia, which we'll talk about. And one thing that we see is that different kinds of brain damage can result in different kinds of amnesia. So we actually see that different areas of the hippocampus are active during memory formation and retrieval. And so, again, while in general, hippocampus is very important for memory, we see different areas involved for formation and retrieval. And so thinking about that different areas of the hippocampus, if there's some damage or impairment or shrinking or something like that, that damage can result in amnesia and different kinds of amnesia depending, again, on where the hippocampus is damaged. So let's talk a little bit about the case study of HM and what were his memory impairments. And I believe we've talked a little bit about him before, and I'm sure you've talked about him in your intro psych class. Henry Molaism is a famous case study that he had experienced very severe seizures, and he had tried different treatments and nothing was working. And this was in 1953 that they did a surgery. They removed his hippocampus. Oh yeah, his hippocampus was removed to prevent epileptic seizures. They removed his hippocampus. They also removed some nearby structures of the medial temporal cortex from both hemispheres. And at the time, the researcher or the surgeons, doctors didn't know what the hippocampus did. So they took out the hippocampus and these nearby structures to try to prevent or at least reduce his seizures. And it did do that. Actually, it did reduce the number of seizures. He still had some after the surgery, but far less than what he had before. But it also has some severe memory impairments. So after the surgery, HM had great difficulty forming new long-term memories. Even some of the older memories were impaired as well, and we're going to talk more about that. Interestingly, his short-term and working memory remained intact. And this is showing the brain and showing the hippocampus, which then we can see, the location of the missing hippocampus. So the two kinds of amnesia, the main two kinds of amnesia, there's anterograde amnesia, which is the loss of ability to form new memory after the brain damage, or in HM's case, after the surgery. And then retrograde amnesia is loss of memory of events prior to the occurrence of brain damage. So in HM's case, prior to the surgery. And of course, it can be easy to mix up the two, anterograde and retrograde. If it helps, here's a cue that thinking of retro, and you can think, oh, let's go retro, right? Like back in the day, retro. And so think about back in the day, that loss of memory of the thing is from back in the day before the surgery or damage or whatever. In terms of HM, he actually showed both types of amnesia after the surgery. We mentioned before his short-term or working memory remained intact. So doing different tests, trying to remember some items in a short period of time, he was able to remember a number even after 15 minutes, which is, impressive, as long as there wasn't distraction. If there was distraction, then yeah, he wasn't able to remember that. And, one particular test, they gave him a number to remember, remember this number, 584. And he came up with this interesting strategy. So to remember the number 584, you just remember 8. You see 5, 8, and 4 add to 17. You remember 8, subtract it from 17, it leaves 9. Divide 9 in half, and you get 5 and 4. And there you are, 584. And of course, that's, seems like a pretty complicated strategy. That's not the strategy I would use. I would probably just repeat the number over and over again, or think like 5, and I don't know. I wouldn't come up with, and like nothing, wrong about it. That's, great. He had the strategy that worked as long as there wasn't any distraction. If there was a distraction, he wouldn't remember the number. He wouldn't even remember his complicated strategy. And yeah, so that was HM. And actually, we do see that a lot of patients with severe amnesia also show normal working memory as long as there's no distraction. And of course, we can even think, for those of us who don't have brain damage or amnesia, again, with working memory, we tend to do better if there's no distraction. So similar things with people with amnesia. So thinking about his impairments, short-term memory, working memory was good, but there were some aspects of his long-term memory that had some impairments. So one thing we saw that he wasn't able to state the date, the year, the current year, or his age. After or the first few years after his surgery, when they were asked him, what year is it? And how old are you? He would say that the year is 1953 and that he's 27 years old. And he was actually born in 1926. So, a few years after, or 1953, and a few years after 1953, he was saying he was born in 1953. Yeah. And then he would say he's 27. And so the thing is, his surgery occurred in 1953, and he was 27 years old at the time of his surgery. And so after that, like, he wasn't able to accurately state his age or his birth date or even what year it is. After the first few years after his surgery, then he was all kinds of random. And so asking, what year was he born? What year is it now? How old are you? Things like that. It was just completely wild guessing. Sometimes it was like 10 years difference. Sometimes it was like 50 years difference. It was just completely random guessing after a while. Some other thing is they saw that HM could read the same magazine repeatedly without losing interest. So he would read a magazine, and that was nice, and then not remember it, and read it again, and oh, this is interesting, and read it again, and yeah, like he wasn't remembering that he had read it. It's similar to 10-Second Tom, and so I'm going to have this link on the lecture guide. If you've seen the movie 50 First Dates, right? Is that what it's called? With Adam Sandler and Drew Barrymore, which is a fun movie. It's a fictional movie. But they show this character that he only remembers things for 10 seconds. So he is all like, hi, nice to meet you. Hi, I'm Tom, and things like that after every 10 seconds because he doesn't remember meeting people, which is, a fictional example, but that is actually pretty similar to a lot of people with amnesia may not remember. They meet somebody, or they say something and then they just forget, or they read the magazine and then they forget. I do want to mention with that movie, in case anyone has watched the movie or is thinking like, oh, this is applying memory stuff, and it is. There's memory stuff, but there's also a fictional condition. The main character, Drew Barrymore, the movie seems to be demonstrating anterograde amnesia. They call it something else, which is fictional, but what they demonstrate in the movie is also fictional. Because in the movie, they're saying, so she can't make new memories, and they say that her memory is better during the day and then gets worse after she sleeps, which that's not consistent with evidence, right? Like when we were recently talking about sleep, and that during sleep you can do some memory consolidation. So your memory should actually get better after sleep. Not to say that people with amnesia, their memory will get all the way better after sleep. But yeah, so just to keep in mind, if you're familiar with the movie, know that that's definitely fiction. If you're not familiar with the movie, never mind. It is fiction. It is a good movie, though. I encourage you guys to watch it for fun. If you get the chance, it's fun. Anyway, back to HM. So he could only recall a few fragments of events in the recent past. Like he, later in his life in 1980, he moved to a nursing home. After a few years after that, he couldn't remember where he had lived or who had cared for him or what was going on. He was watching the news every night, and similar to the magazine, wouldn't remember, could only remember just like fragments of events. So not really events, but just like a little bit of bits and pieces. When they showed him photographs of himself, he didn't recognize himself. And interestingly, if there was a photograph of him and his mother, he could recognize his mother, but not himself. And what's interesting is like, well, look who's standing next to your mother. Like, couldn't that be you? And I don't know. So the interesting thing is that he did recognize himself in a mirror. So it's interesting to think about how come he couldn't recognize himself in a photo, but he could recognize himself in a mirror. And so we can think about it, what's going on with that? What could explain that? And we could speculate that, if you're looking at yourself in a mirror, you're seeing your reflection, you're doing some movements with your arms or your head, or you're turning your head, you're moving your arms around, you're scratching your head, you're doing some dance moves. And so like, then you see you know that you're doing these things, and you see your reflection doing those things. And so kind of by deducing, you can think about, oh, that must be me then. So that is one possible explanation how come he could recognize himself in a mirror, whereas he's looking at a photograph and he's saying, well, that could be anyone pretty much. Thinking about semantic memory, so just as a reminder, semantic memory involves memory of factual information or knowledge-based information. So for example, remembering the fact that Aurora University is in Aurora, Illinois, and Aurora is in Illinois, so memories of factual information. We saw, or researchers saw, that HM was able to form a few weak semantic memories. For example, when given first names of kind of some famous people or people who became famous after 1953, that he would sometimes be able to come up with their last names. Like if they said the name Elvis, and then he would be able to come up with Presley. And they would say Martin, and he could say Luther King. And Fidel, and he could say Castro. So he was able to make a few weak semantic memories. Not, he couldn't remember all the new facts or that knowledge that he was coming up. Like again, watching the news and things like that, wasn't able to remember all of them, was able to remember some, a little bit. With episodic memory, so as a reminder, episodic memory has to do with memory of your own life events, your personal events, autobiographical memory, so personal experiences, kinds of things. HM could not describe any experience since his surgery. And then even before his surgery, he could remember or describe a few experiences. So his episodic memory was severely impaired. He had some impairments with semantic memory, and especially impairments with episodic memory. That before his surgery, he could remember a few personal experiences, but not most of them. And then since the surgery, couldn't remember any personal experiences. This would have been something we'd talk about in class, to think about, and we'll just talk a little bit about it here, thinking about how memory loss might influence people's ability to imagine the future. And I'm sad we didn't get these awesome hoverboards in 2015 that were in Back to the Future. I mean, we got those so-called hoverboards, which look kind of like Segways without the handle, and yeah. I wanted these. I wanted the ones from Back to the Future. But yeah, like we can think about from back in the day when the movie creators were coming up with, the ideas for the future of 2015, that we would have these awesome pink hoverboards or whatever color. But yeah, so probably as they were imagining these, devices, they were relying on their memory, thinking about skateboards, obviously, and how much fun they are, and thinking about like, ooh, wouldn't it be cool if they fly? And I think it was mostly in the second movie, right, when they were in the future, which is now in the past. We should go back to the future. But yeah, when there were the flying cars. And so again, thinking about when we're imagining the future and we're thinking about, okay, well, we drive cars now and we know there's traffic. And in the movie, again, I think it was the second one, that when Doc Brown is driving the flying car and there's all that traffic and stuff like that. And so again, we're using our memory like based on what we know and imagining the future. And so we can think about, like, how do you guys imagine the future 10 years from now, 50 years, 100 years from now? What are things going to be like? And we can imagine, and so we kind of start with what we know, what we remember, and you know, robots are going to take over the world because, you know, there's a lot of technology now, and hopefully, you know, they won't take over the world. But anyway, we can just think about based on what we know and then expand from there and imagine the future. Oh, and then, yeah, so as far as people who have some memory loss, then they don't have that base of what they remember to start off from to then imagine the future. Okay. One thing that we see with almost all patients with memory loss is that they tend to have better implicit memory, better implicit than explicit memory. Explicit memory is the deliberate recall of information as memory. We can think of like declarative memory is explicit. It's kind of like conscious. You're consciously remembering things. Compared to implicit memory is more like the influence of experience on behavior. And we can think of procedural memory as implicit, where it's more of this unconscious, you don't really remember, it's more like you know things. You don't really remember learning it, or it doesn't, yeah, it's different. You know how to do it. You know how to do whatever. And so we'll come back to procedural memory, but yeah, so thinking explicit and implicit memory, they did some research with another patient with amnesia. So this is not HM, but the effects are similar across people with amnesia. So what they did in this study, they had this person with amnesia that was interacting with 3 different nurses. And then the 3 different nurses were told to behave in a certain way with the patient. So one was told to be consistently friendly, nice and sweet and happy. One was told to act as neutral as possible. And then one was told to act as stern as possible. So basically refusing requests, making the patient do boring tasks, you know, things like that. And then later on, the patient was shown 3 pictures, 3 photographs, one of each nurse. And the patient said, like, had never seen them before, didn't recognize them at all because, again, the person had amnesia. And they did the study several times because the patient never remembered answering the questions or seeing these people. And so they were asking the patient, look at these 3 photographs and tell us which nurse you would approach like as a possible friend, or which one you would ask for help or whatever. And so he consistently chose the friendly nurse, the one who had behaved friendly, and avoided the stern nurse, but could never say why. And in the photographs, all of the nurses were pleasant looking. All of them were smiling, you know, in the pictures. But thinking about that experience, even though the patient didn't remember the experience at all, but it then influenced their choice of, I'm just going to go with the friendly one because I don't know why, but I'm going to go with that. With procedural memory. So procedural memory is a kind of implicit memory. Procedural memory often involves development of motor skills and habits. So we can think about some examples of procedural memory are like tying your shoes. When you tie your shoes, you really don't consciously think about it, right? You just do it. And in fact, if you did actually stop to think about it, to be conscious, aware of what are the steps in tying your shoes, it would probably even take you longer to tie your shoes because you're like, wait, what? You know, it's more automatic. We're used to doing it automatic. Or we can say like riding a bike, assuming you've learned how to ride a bike. And if you haven't in a long time, odds are once you get back on the bike, you'll start riding it because it's that intact or implicit, based on experience, that kind of unconscious knowing how to do things. So there's a lot of examples that people with amnesia actually have intact procedural memories, that they could remember how to do things, motor skills, things like that, even if they weren't completely aware of it. With HM, he had learned to read words written backwards, like if you were writing in a mirror, he had learned to do this and wasn't aware of, like, didn't even know that he could do that. But he could. He never even remembered learning it, but yeah, he was able to do that. Clive Waring was a brilliant pianist, would play amazing, beautiful music. And you can look on I used to have a video, but they took it down. You can look on YouTube to see if you can find a video where he'll sit at the piano and he will play amazing music, like beautiful, complicated music. And immediately after, like while he's still sitting at the piano, after he plays, he doesn't remember. He's like, I don't know how to play the piano. And it's like after he just did, but he doesn't remember that he knows how to do it. Like he can do it, but he's not completely aware. And especially afterwards, and they're saying like, oh, can you play the piano? And he's like, no, I don't know. Which is, you know, sad. But anyway, some other research too with the game Tetris, if you guys remember Tetris, or, you know, there's been a lot of variations since. In general, people with, you know, without amnesia can play the games, and the more you play, generally the better that you get. You rotate the pieces to make them fit and things like that. I mean, obviously the game gets more complicated and harder levels and things like that. But in general, for the healthy individual, that playing it over time, they get better. And we actually see that with people with amnesia too, that playing it more often, they do gradually show some improvement. The difference though is that they don't remember playing the game at all, right? They're like, oh, I've never played this before. And then they play, and, you know, after doing some time, some experience, having some practice, they have some improvement. But they're all like, oh, I've never played it before. I don't know what's going on. And interestingly too, which if you've ever played it a lot, sometimes like when you're going to bed, you might see kind of the blocks or the images in your mind. You're like, ooh, I've been playing this too much. I know. And that's happened to me. I'm a gamer. I do that. And that would happen to people with amnesia too, that after playing, and again, they wouldn't remember playing, but after playing a good amount for several days, when they would go to sleep, they would see those images in their mind, like the blocks and things, and they were like, what is this? What's going on? Because they couldn't remember playing. They didn't know why they were seeing these things. Yeah, interesting stuff. So a little bit of a summary with what we see typical patterns of people with amnesia, that in general, there is normal working memory. Working memory is intact unless there's distraction. We see severe anterograde amnesia for declarative memory, especially with episodic memory. Remember, declarative memory divides into semantic and episodic. There is some impairment with semantic, but a special impairment with episodic memories, episodic memories, including both before and after the damage. And then in general, better implicit than explicit memory. And nearly intact procedural memory. Yeah, along the lines of the better implicit than explicit, nearly intact procedural memory, that knowing how to do things, even though with people with amnesia, they may not know that they know how to do that. They may not remember having just done it, like playing the piano, but they can do it. Okay. So let's talk a little more about the hippocampus, because obviously hippocampus very much involved with memory. And we see that it's especially critical for declarative memory, especially with the episodic memory. We see that hippocampus is also important for spatial memory and contextual learning. And so let's talk a little bit more about spatial memory and contextual learning, starting with spatial memory. So if we were in class, we would talk about this and think about what would be the best route to take to go from our classroom to the Aurora Library. And let's see, we can even thinking about it now and not Google and not look at the campus map and try to even remember where our classroom is in the Institute on the 3rd floor, kind of near, right across or right next to the room that I was in, that if you guys had questions, you know, that walk across like that bridge or whatever from the bathroom and elevator to our classroom. Anyway, so our classroom, and then to the library, that which stairwell would we take and what door would we go out of, and then where would that put us depending on which door, and then where we would go, would we turn right or turn left, or how would we go to the library? And so if we were answering this question and not looking at a map, but looking, like, we would probably be visualizing a map, or we'd be visualizing the campus, right? And thinking about, okay, you go down this stairwell and then there's this door, and then where would you be? And then you take a right or a left or whatever, you're probably visualizing and you're using your spatial memory. Or if we can say, what's the best route to go from our classroom to the zoo? Or we can think about from your home, to go from your home to, the zoos are closed right now, but let's say they were open and you're going to the Lincoln Park Zoo. Then depending on where you live, of course, that, you know, what roads are you going to take? What tollways are you going to take? How you're going to go to the zoo. So, and again, not looking at a map, not looking at Google or GPS, but thinking on your own, you're using your spatial memory. So we see that the hippocampus is very important for spatial memory. That damage to the hippocampus can impair ability on spatial tasks. And so we're going to look at a couple of tasks, especially with research with rats, the radial maze, where, and actually, so a lot of research with rats, but there's some simulated mazes on the computers that we do research with humans too. But yeah, so with the radial maze, you have a maze that has 8 or more arms with a reinforcer at the end. And I have a picture coming up. Or the Morris water maze task, where there's kind of like a little pool of water, murky water, and then the rats need to swim around and find a platform to sit on and rest on that's just underneath the surface. So let's start with the radial maze. So this is the maze where it has the different arms. And at the end of each arm, there would be a little bit of food, or at the end of some arms, there might be a little bit of food. And so the rat is placed in the center of the maze and then has to navigate through the different arms to find the food. And so I have a simulation here, and you do need to be in the PowerPoint view to watch it in your in the PowerPoint. If you're not in PowerPoint view, it looks really weird. The next few slides will look really weird. But if you're in the PowerPoint view, because it's an animation, so you can see the animation. So yeah, in this example, all 8 arms are baited with food. So putting the food at the end of each arm, which is going to be naturally reinforcing. The rat is placed in the middle, and it wants the food. Okay, so we can press spacebar to begin the test session. And there goes the rat to get some food. Yay, we did it. So yeah, so we can think about what you noticed in the simulation, thinking about the rat's performance, whether it was efficient, and thinking about how you would explain the rat's performance. Was the rat really depending on its memory, or was there some other strategy involved? And so in this case, this was a healthy rat. I mean, the rat did great. You know, an efficient strategy would be to do like one arm at a time and then remember which arm you went through and already got the food, right? Like that makes sense. And that's pretty much what this rat did in the simulation. That was great. We could think about maybe there are some other cues. Possible that the rat can smell the food, and so then that would help direct it to go down whichever arm. We could also think maybe some external cues. Let's actually go back to the picture, that if maybe some of the arms were closer to a window, if they were seeing some daylight, or if some of the floors of the arms were kind of rougher than the others, maybe they could remember, ooh, the arm with the rougher floor doesn't have food, or the arm that's near the window, I already went down that one. So yeah, there can be some cues. There can definitely still be some memory too. And what we see with rats that have damage to the hippocampus, that they can still learn as far as which arms to go down, which arms to avoid, but it's a lot more gradual. It can be slower learning to learn that I already went down this arm. Or let's say that not all of the arms had food. So they went down an arm, saw that there wasn't any food, later went down that same arm again, later went down that same arm again, that not learning, not remembering that there isn't food. It takes them longer. The ones that have the hippocampus damage can take longer. And even after a lot of training, they might still go down the wrong arm, the arm without food, more than once. Or even if they went down one arm that had food, then they might go down that arm again, even though it doesn't have food. So they can still make those mistakes, even after a lot of training. With humans, yeah, so they've done this kind of thing, like a simulation, that not necessarily a rat, but as far as like having a maze, and not necessarily looking just like this, but having a maze that people are working through, like a game kind of puzzle, working through a maze. And again, we saw, or researchers have seen, that people with damage to the hippocampus are a bit slower to learn which arms are never correct, or even after they get the prize at one arm, and then they might still go to that arm even though then no longer is there a prize there. It takes them a bit longer to learn that and to remember that. The other maze that we talked about is the Morris water maze. That this is a healthy rat, no hippocampal damage, that you put the rat in this little pool of water, and you can see the red lines are the lines of the rat swimming around. It's trying to find the platform. Rats don't really like to swim that much, so it's that natural reinforcement of they are swimming, they want to stop swimming, they want to go and rest on this platform. And so for the healthy rat, kind of swimming, especially closer to the outer edges, trying to find this platform, swimming around, and phew, we found it. And so this is actually showing learning over time for a healthy rat, that, they take some training, take some time to learn, the first time they're in the water, the, second, third, or fourth, or fifth time, they're swimming around, and then they find it. And after several trainings, then it's much easier that they can just go and find the platform and go and sit and rest. With rats with hippocampal damage, that's, again, slower to learn to find the platform. And that's only if the platform starts in the same place. If they put the platform in different places, the rats with hippocampal damage, forget it. Like, they will just be swimming all around, and not finding it. They won't be learning. They won't be able to find the new location of the platform. Even if the rat didn't start out with hippocampal damage and had learned this task, and then there was hippocampal damage, even though that they had learned it previously, after the hippocampal damage, then again, those rats can't find the platform. And it's much harder to learn where it is. And again, there has been some research with humans that using computer simulation, similar kinds of things, and see similar impairments in spatial memory when there's hippocampal damage. Okay, moving into contextual memory, and this is going to be the participation activity. This is what a discussion we would have had in class, that getting into small groups, and then describe something that you experienced yesterday in as much detail as you can. And then describe something that you experienced either a few months ago or a few years ago, again, using as much detail as you can. So I'll put the discussion forum up that describe something you experienced yesterday in as much detail as you can. Describe something you experienced either a few months ago or a few years ago as much detail as you can. And then compare your two narratives, your descriptions, in terms of how much detail did you get. So the thing is, what we tend to see is that more recent memories tend to have more detail. When we're thinking about context, we can think about sights, sounds, smells, locations, who else was there. That's what we mean by context. So in general, recent episodic memories include a lot more contextual detail. Older memories tend to have less detail. One thing too, we see that as time passes and the memories become less detailed, they tend to be less dependent on the hippocampus and more dependent on the cerebral cortex. Especially when we're remembering factual information, old factual information, semantic memory, that doesn't activate the hippocampus as much. Episodic memory, older episodic memory does activate the hippocampus more so than older semantic memory. And again, a lot of that could be related to context, that like, oh, who was there? Like your high school graduation, you might think about who was there. Was it a sunny day? Was it windy? Yeah, fun time. Did you have a graduation party right after the graduation? And who all was there? Family, friends, things like that. With basal ganglia, we can think about gradual learning, implicit habit learning. That after there's damage to the hippocampus, there can still be learning, but it's kind of gradually. So going back to like the water mazes or the radial arm maze, that there can be learning, it just can be slower than if there wasn't hippocampal damage. But we also see gradual learning is dependent on the basal ganglia. We can think about an example that if you play basketball and if you're used to guarding a certain person and you kind of know what their strategy is, or you learn what their strategy is, that you know what to expect. Maybe they're more likely to shoot from the outside when the team is kind of having lower scores, or maybe they're more likely, I don't know, to do a three-pointer or whatever, like depending. You kind of get to learn what they might be doing as you continue to have this experience, and then maybe you can guard them and not let them make a basket or whatever. But yeah, so we do see that it's the hippocampus and especially the basal ganglia activation too. And so we can think about people who have hippocampal damage can have definitely some memory impairments, but there can still be the gradual learning, especially because if the basal ganglia is still intact and might even be compensating for hippocampus not working out as well, basal ganglia can still be involved. Okay, and then other areas of the brain, most of the brain actually does contribute to memory in different ways. We've talked before about amygdala and emotion, and especially with fear, and I think we talked about this before, that amygdala is associated with fear learning. So learning, not to take this dark alley at 3 a.m. By yourself and things like that. So amygdala involved with fear learning, with emotional aspects of memory. Parietal lobe is also involved with piecing information together, so thinking about like the detail of episodic memories. The anterior temporal complex is involved with semantic memory, and we'll talk more about dementia in a later topic. Semantic dementia can especially occur when there's damage to this part of the brain. And semantic dementia is a specific kind of dementia so remember, semantic memory is like factual knowledge-based information. So with semantic dementia, you might see something like a sheep, some animal that you used to know, but then you're trying to identify what the object or creature is, and you can't. And it's not even just that you don't know what the word is, but you don't recall ever having encountered it before. So I've never seen, what is that white fluffy thing? I've never seen that before. Why is it saying that to me? Like, what is that? That not being able to identify it, not being able to remember seeing it ever. The prefrontal cortex we mentioned is involved with learned behavior. Of course, it's involved with working memory and involved with decision making. And basal ganglia too, of course, we mentioned it on the previous slide. Basal ganglia is also involved with some reward behavior, and so that could kind of be with learning, and then obviously with the gradual learning too. Yeah. Okay, so that was the learning and memory lecture. Next time we'll be doing cognition and language, and to be chapter 13. But yeah, so learning and memory, and then that participation activity is with the contextual memory and details. All right, let me know if you guys have any questions. Talk to you soon.